I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. A few weeks ago, I came across an article that was critical of the most recent season of The White Lotus. I don't know how many people have watched that show. Looking at the faces here, and maybe not too many, but maybe a few of you. And so I read the article, and it was critical for all the reasons people are often critical of shows like that. Like, it's saying this about Buddhism, it's saying that about Buddhism, it's white spiritual tourism and whatever. And this was based off of like the first couple episodes. But anytime something like that gets into like that part of online Buddhism, I always get curious as to the motivations this way or that way, why people say what they say. And I also wanted to make sure that if anyone ever asked me about it, I have some kind of response. So I ended up watching that season of The White Lotus, season 3, which was set in Thailand, because I figured people might ask me, representing the wilderness tradition to the extent that I do. Someone might be like, hey, like, how close was it to whatever? And it turns out not all that much. But in any case, I sat myself down and watched a whole season of a show that I didn't really enjoy, but I figured I would do it for good, wholesome reasons, so that I'd have something important to say. But it was kind of funny watching that, because I'd be sitting there watching an episode, my wife would walk into the living room, see what I had on TV, roll her eyes, and walk out. So it wasn't much her thing either. But in any case, people have thoughts about this particular season because this season takes place in a historically Buddhist country. There are a couple monks that are in the show, a little tiny bit. And, there's at least one character who's actively interested in Buddhism for a while. And so, people have ideas about what's going on here. But, like, what a weird show to have anything about Buddhism in it anyway. Like, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the show, but it's kind of one of those, like, murder whodunit shows where, at the beginning of any one of the 3 seasons, it starts with one of the White Lotus resorts where someone is dead. You don't know who. They're in a body bag and they're being carted away. And then it'll go 1 week later. And then it's like whatever's, happening. And the gist of it that I've gotten from my little exposure to it is that it tends to be a lot of really complicated people living in the gray areas, but mostly kind of awful people. And, it has a bit of an upstairs, downstairs dynamic because there are the people who are there enjoying the resort, and then there are the people working at the resort. And there's that whole class dynamic of what their life is like and what the other people's lives are like and everything. And that's still pretty much what the show is, even when they bring it to Thailand. It's not like they changed up the formula. The only difference I saw is that you have one person that likes to do yoga and meditate a little bit, and there's a bunch of B-roll footage of monkeys in the forest and the jungle. Because I think the creator of the show, Mike White, I think, was playing around with the idea of like, monkey mind and like human nature, and we're basically just animals, and there's the kind of see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil kind of stuff going on too. Either way, it was kind of strange in that I thought this was going to be like the Buddhist season because everyone kept telling me that it was. And it's really not. It's just a lot of people living their lives, usually making really poor and really, really unfortunate choices. And then one character with her family visits a monastery a couple times, and then that's pretty much it. But I will focus on that part because I think that's the part that people will wonder what I think about, because here they are, this very affluent East Coast family. They're in Thailand. The daughter's in her early 20s and she's in college and she's interested in Buddhism, and so she's dragging the family to Thailand so she can go visit a monastery. And then, they got whatever actor to wear the traditional robes and say some stuff that sounds vaguely Buddhist. And one part in particular struck me as really funny because so much of it was just sort of generic meditative advice. The monk is sitting up there and he's on his little dais, and there's a bunch of white 20-somethings sitting in front of him, and he's just like, yes, you're watching your mind, thoughts come up, and you watch them come up, and you watch them go, bye-bye. Like, that's how cute, adorable, little old monk saying that stuff, right? But then it stops being cute at another point in the story. In fact, this actually takes place earlier, where there's one character who is contemplating taking his own life. And he decides to talk to the monk, and the monk doesn't know any of this. He doesn't know what's going on with this guy. But this guy asks the monk, hey, what happens when we die? And, the thing is that if you ask some monks, perhaps they might have like a whole sort of lesson on that. Like, they, like certain traditions, for example, in Tibet, like they have like the whole book of the dead and all that stuff, and the space in between this life and the next life, and all the different existences you might go through. There's a whole like course that they have on that. But then you ask other monks, and it's like, hey, like what happens when we die? And they'll be like, I don't know, I haven't died yet, something like along those lines, right? And there's a kind of a middle ground there, which is like, well, whatever happens, it's determined by your actions. It's determined by your karma. So if you're afraid of where you might end up in the next life or after you die, just make sure that whatever you do with the time you have, be skillful, do good things, be generous, give, cultivate good qualities in your mind. As you approach death, try to have a mind that is free of greed, free of aversion, free of delusion, and all that kind of stuff. And that would be really good. But then what this monk says is something so wild and so strange and so foreign to me that I was shocked as I saw it, because, what this monk essentially says is that, oh, well, your life is like a drop of water up in the air, like as like the waves are crashing, and then like, the drop falls back into the water, and it's like, oh, you just come home, right? Which, okay, that's fine. A lot of people have those kind of beliefs. They think they're a drop of water and they return to the ocean, one with everything kind of stuff. But when you're talking to someone who's considering ending his life, that might not be the best advice. Telling him that, like, yeah, dying's actually super cool. It feels really good. And then you're just like home forever. And so he tells this guy this, and he's just like, wow, I think this monk's the real deal. That's what he keeps saying for like the remainder of the show, is how I think this guy's the real thing, because he's telling me it's okay. Whatever happens, however I die, whatever I do, it's all good, because I'm going home, right? Which was just so strange. And so I got curious, like, okay, Mike White is the creator of the show. He writes, he directs. This is his baby through and through. I was like, okay, well, clearly he wasn't all that interested in being accurate in his depiction of Thai monks. Like, why might that be? And I found out that Mike White, before making the show White Lotus, which is like a big hit, apparently a lot of people really like it. I don't know how people feel about this season, but I've heard that the first couple seasons people really enjoyed. Well before that, he had another HBO show called Enlightened, where I think it's Enlightened. It's Enlightenment or Enlightened. But in any case, it's like Laura Dern, and she has this big mental, like this big crash out like this. So she blows up at work in a really bad way. And so she ends up going on some kind of like healing restorative retreat in Hawaii, and comes back sort of like high and mighty, better than everyone. She's just so convinced that she's like, enlightened now. And she tries to like fix the lives of those around her and kind of fix the company that she ends up going back to and whatnot. And so it's one of those weird shows of someone who pretty much is convinced they've got things figured out. They really don't, and they try their best anyway. But all in all, a very flawed character, better than they were before, but still extremely flawed. And there was an interview where they were talking to Mike White, and he was basically saying, like, well, it's kind of based on what happened to me. Like, I had this big outburst at work one time, and, it kind of destroyed my reputation, and I read a bunch of what he coined Buddhist self-help books, and then that kind of got him back on track, so to speak, and he went back and, went back to work and everything. And so, that show was successful for a while. I think it was on for maybe a couple seasons or so. I'm not really sure. And then he ends up doing White Lotus, where it's more of like similar characters. Like there's a lot of people with good intentions, a lot of bad intentions, but they're all just sort of flawed characters. And so in this one season that's meant to have some Buddhist themes, where I definitely think he was trying to touch on what we traditionally call like the three poisons, but we might just say that there are these three unwholesome qualities that are the stems from which, like the roots from which all other unwholesome hindrances arise, which you've also heard me say in every loving kindness meditation, which is, we're trying to have hearts and minds free of greed, aversion, and delusion. And so you look at the main stories in this particular season of the show, and you see people definitely struggling with greed. You see people struggling with aversion, certainly in the form of hate and anger, and you see delusion and ignorance in many of the characters. But the thing is that even those that are trying to find a way out just end up sort of staying where they are. Like even the one character that's very interested in Buddhism finds out that she's not so interested after all, because she's really comfortable in the life that she has. And so she's sort of visits a monastery a couple times and then goes on with her life, being a pampered girl of a wealthy family, which is just disheartening for someone who, in my case, I would love to see more Buddhist themed shows and movies and stuff. I've been honest of the fact that when I was young, I watched Little Buddha, which certainly is a weird movie, but also kind of brilliant. And it was the movie that when I was 8 years old made me realize that, like, whoa, Buddhism's a thing. I would hate for the White Lotus season 3 to be the thing that does it for someone else. Like, hey, Buddhism's a thing. Like, maybe not this Buddhism. And like, there's the silly stuff that they got wrong for like silly reasons. Like, for example, one of the things that happens is that two of the characters decide to stay overnight at the monastery. And for some reason, there's a meal in the evening, which if you know anything about, like a Thai forest or Thai wilderness monastery, or even any Thai monastery, there's typically not any food at night for people who are staying over, because they're usually following the 8 precepts. So that was already kind of weird. But then the two of them complained that the food is vegetarian, which it usually isn't at a Thai monastery, and that the food is bland and flavorless. Now, I don't know if you've had Thai food before, and especially Thai food made by Thai people, but I don't think any Western person from an affluent, like, WASP family would consider the food bland, right? So just strange things like that. Also, the very idea that there's some kind of program where people can stay there for a year, and it's like a kind of college dorm style thing where people are visiting each other's rooms at night, like just a bunch of stuff that wouldn't fly. And that's all just silly stuff that someone wouldn't know if they've never been in a monastery, certainly a Thai monastery. And fine, he's writing a TV show, it's meant to be fun. But it's when he has someone dressed up in robes and saying things that would, in a real context, be extremely careless, that all of a sudden now I'm like, ooh, as someone who shares the Dharma, maybe I've got something to say on that. And it's simply because as Buddhists, we try to be very skillful in our words. Last month I was talking about how, we follow precepts because we're trying to train, and one way of talking about it is we're trying to train in heightened virtue. We're trying to be virtuous people, but also we're trying to encourage others to be virtuous as well. I brought up the fact that, hey, if you decide to steal, that's already pretty bad. But if you start encouraging people to steal, like you decide to put a course together, like this is how you steal, because you can find anything on the internet. I'm sure there's someone who's like, lockpicking 101, You don't know what kind of damage you're doing to the world by releasing that out there, right? And so it's the same idea when someone asks a really esoteric, metaphysical, spiritual question, like, you don't know why they're asking. Like, what happens when we die, And we have in the suttas examples where the Buddha chooses to stay quiet on precisely those kinds of questions, depending on who's asking, right? And there's an example of someone who came up and wanted to have really, really metaphysical questions answered. Like, what is the nature of the person? Like, is the person eternal or not? Do we die and then go somewhere else? Is it like this and like that? All these kind of questions, and then the Buddha decides he's not going to answer. And, this person who asked the questions ends up leaving. And then his attendant, who in most cases is Ananda, ends up asking the Buddha, like, hey, like, why didn't you answer that guy's questions? And so, well, if I had answered them, no matter how I answered, it wouldn't have done him any good. That's the gist of it. And I'm someone that used to be extremely into philosophy. In fact, I have a bachelor's in Western philosophy. That's how into it I was. Where everyone else was doing something really practical with their time in college, I was reading Descartes, Sartre, and even older, because I was really interested in ancient Greek philosophy. So I was reading not only Plato, but I was reading like Neoplatonic people like Plotinus and his Enneads. And if you ever want to like give yourself a migraine, go ahead and open up the Enneads. It'll do the trick really well. But at a certain point, as I continued to practice and found teachers that I really respected and admired, those that I really wanted to emulate, those were precisely the ones that refused to look at Buddhism as a kind of philosophy, that they didn't want to get into those kind of sticky conversations. Instead, they tend to look at the path, and now I do too, as more like an apprenticeship. You're learning skills. So it's less like sitting at the foot of Socrates, let's say, or Aristotle. And it's more like being an apprentice to like a blacksmith or a goldsmith. And the goldsmith is actually really helpful because that's an example that the Buddha gave too. He had a goldsmith story, a lesson talking about how we train our minds, how we develop skillful qualities, and we're like the goldsmith that knows how to heat the gold to the right temperature, to know when the gold should be cooled down, when it should be heated up more, how to remove impurities from the gold until the gold is shining and pure and useful and malleable, can be shaped into whatever it needs to be shaped into. And that's precisely what we're doing with the mind. So when we have these kind of questions come up, and so many people do, one way or the other, and so many people not only have questions, they think they have answers. I can't tell you, throughout the course of my relatively short life, although it's getting longer by the day, how many people have had an answer to those kind of questions? Well, I know what happens when you die. I know what happens when I die. I know what heaven is like. I know what hell is like. I know what this is like and that is like. And you have to wonder, like, well, how do you know? You been there? Like, were you on the 605 one time and you took the wrong exit and there you are, hell. And I was like, no, that's just the city of industry, something like that. But I mean this in all honesty. We want to set those questions aside for a good reason. The Buddha said as much in his handful of leaves. One time he was sitting with a bunch of his disciples in a beautiful grove of trees. And there were leaves in the trees, leaves on the ground, and he decides to pick some up, and he holds them in his hand. And he says, I, through my release, through my awakening, have learned all kinds of things. But what I teach is what is in my hand here, these handful of leaves. Everything else is set aside because it's not pertinent, it's not relevant to what we're trying to do, which is that triple training we've talked about before: heightened virtue, heightened mind, heightened discernment, right? To say it another way, we're working on conduct, we're working on concentration, and we're working on wisdom. And that's it. That's a very personal thing. It's not a philosophical thing. It's not a metaphysical thing. And not to say that Buddhism doesn't have all of that as well, because it does. You can't talk about karma and you can't talk about rebirth without having some kind of faith in that process. But it's always brought back to the person. It's always brought back to our mind and our heart and how we're living our lives. And so that means that when we have these discussions, and remember, we're on a path where it's very fruitful to have discussions. We're meant to discuss. We're not meant to just read. Well before the suttas were written down, before the whole Tipitaka was written down, it was an oral tradition, shared orally from person to person. We are meant to have discussions, but we're supposed to be having discussions on how to live skillfully, not to have philosophical answers to questions, getting caught in quagmires, literally getting caught in a thicket of views. That's how the Buddha described it, getting caught in a thicket of views. And I see people getting caught in thickets all the time. And you never know what the fallout of that is. Now, I know I'm talking about a TV show, the third season of White Lotus. It's eventually going to fade into my memory. I can't wait. It's going to be gone, and I won't remember this show. There's a lot of really troubling stuff that happened in it. Don't take this as any endorsement to find out for yourselves. No, I don't mean any, how do the kids say it? No shade at Mike White. I just think that if people are serious about Buddhism, they shouldn't be looking at shows like that to teach them anything relevant about the Buddha, about the Dhamma, and about the Sangha, because you won't find it there. But I do think that it is important to have the conversations, but remember that the conversations are about what we think, what we do, what we say. Keep it practical in that sense. In fact, that's a point I've tried to make for a long time. I'm grateful that message seems to be received. I remember one time someone leaving a comment about what I share online. It's like, he always makes it so practical. And the thing is I can't really take credit for that, because that's what I find in my teachers and their teachers, and I find in the canon itself. That it is deeply practical, because what you're learning to do is learning how to act, in every sense of that word. Learning how to act, learning how to be. And so, when someone like this comes up with a question like, what happens when we die? I don't know. I'm still figuring out how to live. That might be how we respond to something like that. Because that's what we're learning how to do. We're learning how to live skillfully. One of the beautiful ways I've heard it described is we're training ourselves in the habits and practices of the noble ones. The noble ones are the disciples and the Buddha himself, who have become fully released from all suffering, released from all sadness, released from all stress. So we're learning how to be happy. And happiness happens in the present moment, right here and right now. So rather than speculating on what happens in the afterlife, we think about our actions right now. And if our actions are good, then, as the Buddha said, he said this in the Kalama Sutta, right? He says, well, if there's no afterlife of any kind, no other life, no future life, and you've been skillful, then as you approach death, you can take a sigh of relief, knowing, I've done good in the world. All right. And that's my legacy. But if there is an afterlife and future lives based on karma, action, then you know that wherever you're going, it's going to be somewhere that at least is as good as what you had right now, and hopefully better. But you don't want to just rest on that. You want to keep developing all the way until the very end. Many Buddhist traditions talk about how the very final thought, your last thought, which means your last intention, carries special weight into what happens in the next life. Some traditions say that your last thought is your first thought in the next life. So they often say, okay, make sure it's a good one. And the only way we can do that is if we do this practice of developing our minds and learning how to pick and choose the kind of thoughts that we have throughout the day, which is something that we can learn. So much of the time we think that our thoughts just bubble up like a spring. We have no control over what happens in our minds. And that lack of control is more an issue of habit, because we do have the ability to control our thoughts. Not entirely. There's always still going to be little silly things that pop up. You can be really skillful and developed after years of practice, and you'll be sitting and your mind's mostly still, but then in the back somewhere there might be like, toaster strudel. I don't know why, but it's there, And that stuff is okay, but you learn how to relate to that differently as well. You don't attach to it. You don't hold on to it. You don't pull it and decide to investigate it in several ways. You're able to switch, move away from those thoughts. And the more you do that, the more you don't have those thoughts come up in the first place. during the meditation we had this morning, that was one of the things that came up in our discussion, which is that the mind, in a Buddhist sense, is one of our senses. And we know oftentimes, after enough meditative experiences and lessons, that as we meditate, we want to have a still mind. We're trying to stay concentrated, mindful of our object of meditation. For many of us, it's often the breath. And so whatever we smell, whatever we taste, whatever we hear, anything, we learn to just let that stuff fade in the background. We're not curious about it. We can just tell ourselves that some sensation has reached a sense door and leave it at that. That's actually one of the lessons from Sariputta. But what we forget is that because the mind is a sense as well, we can also do that with thoughts that come up. Thoughts that are pulling us away from the skillful qualities we're trying to nurture, trying to cultivate. You know, we often think that whatever comes up in our mind is us. We have to claim it, we have to own it, and then we have to play with it, entertain it. And you don't have to. One of the most practical ways we can take the teaching of not self is to apply it to those moments. When something arises in the mind that we know is unskillful, that is pulling us away from the good qualities we're trying to cultivate, we can take a look at it and say, this is not mine, this is not me, this is not myself. We don't have to own it. And then we can move on, switch to something else that we do want to claim. This is a part of this apprenticeship I was talking about earlier. We're learning various skills. And even though eventually we have to give up all identity and all things that we claim as I, me, and mine to be fully released, along the way we're learning how to be selective. My teacher likes to talk about it as trading candy for gold. You know, we have all this useless, sugary nonsense that we're feeding ourselves with, and we have to learn how to give that up to take on something more valuable. And it's the same thing as we cultivate. We're learning to let go of things that we should not claim as I, me, or mine. But there's several things right now as we're developing, cultivating in our hearts and in our minds that are worth holding on to, worth saying, yes, this is me. This is where I choose to stand. So I think that's pretty much it for today. So I want to thank everyone for being here, for listening, and I invite whatever questions or comments, commiserations, if you watched the show, you might have. Thank you.